A shocking letter arrived just weeks after a grandfather's funeral. It was not sympathy or support. It was a bill for $500,000. The parents claimed this money was repayment for everything spent on raising a child: food, clothes, school fees, medical care, and even daily living costs were carefully written down as if the child had been a business project. The demand felt unreal. It treated love like a transaction. It turned childhood into debt. The parents were serious and even warned that refusal would damage the child's reputation and future. Before the funeral, something unusual had already happened. The grandfather, Alden Whitmore, had quietly called his granddaughter aside. He did not speak much, but he handed over a sealed envelope. On the front were 7 carefully written words: "Open only if they ask for money." At the time, the meaning felt unclear and strange. There was no explanation, no smile, just a serious expression that suggested urgency. It was kept safe but forgotten in the pain of losing him. Life after the funeral was already difficult. Grief made everything feel heavy and slow. The grandfather had been the only person who showed real care and support without conditions. Losing him created a deep emptiness that no one else seemed able to fill. Then the letter from the parents changed everything. Inside was the $500,000 demand. It was official, cold, and carefully structured. It listed costs as if raising a child was a financial investment that deserved repayment. There was no warmth, no understanding, only pressure. At first, it seemed like a mistake or a cruel joke, but repeated calls and messages made it clear that the demand was real. The parents were serious, and they expected compliance. That was the moment the memory of the grandfather's envelope returned. The warning suddenly felt important. It was no longer just a strange final message, it felt like preparation for something dangerous. The envelope sat waiting, holding a secret that had not yet been revealed. Whatever was inside had been prepared before death, as if the grandfather already knew what would happen next. And now, with a $500,000 demand on the table, that hidden message was about to become the key to uncovering everything the family had tried to hide for years. Childhood in the Whitmore household never felt warm or safe. Corbin and Marissa Whitmore treated their daughter like a responsibility rather than family. Every mistake was pointed out immediately, and every achievement was brushed aside as if it meant nothing. Compliments were rare, and approval was even rarer. The younger brother, Blaine, lived a completely different life. He was treated like the center of the family. New toys arrived without asking. Expensive trips were planned just for him. Dinner conversations always turned into praise for his behavior, his looks, and his future. He was never questioned, never compared, and never made to feel small. For the daughter, attention always came in the form of criticism. Grades that were high enough for others were never good enough at home. Effort was ignored. Even moments of success were followed by reminders of what could have been done better. Over time, silence became safer than trying to impress anyone. The only place where things felt different was with Grandpa Alden. He never raised his voice. He never compared. He simply listened. Visits to his home felt calm, like stepping outside a storm. He remembered small details and offered support without conditions. That quiet presence became the only comfort in a house filled with pressure. As years passed, Grandpa began to notice patterns that others ignored. He saw how money moved through the family in uneven ways. He saw how conversations changed when certain topics came up. He saw how one child was always lifted up while the other was pushed aside. Without telling anyone, he started keeping records. Simple notes at first, then more detailed observations. Dates, events, financial choices, and behaviors were quietly written down and stored away. Nothing was dramatic on its own, but together, it formed a picture that was hard to ignore. There were also private meetings with legal advisors, held away from family attention. Questions were asked about protection, inheritance control, and what could be done if unfair treatment continued after death. No one in the family knew about these steps. Life continued normally on the surface. The favoritism stayed the same. The criticism never stopped. But behind the scenes, something was being built slowly and carefully. Grandpa Alden was not only watching what was happening, he was preparing for what he believed would come next, even after he was gone. Tessa tried calling her parents right after reading the demand letter. She hoped it was some kind of mistake or a misunderstanding. The phone was picked up quickly, but there was no hesitation or regret in their voices. Corbin spoke first, calm and firm, saying that parents invest years into raising children and deserve repayment when those children become adults. Marissa followed with the same tone, repeating that everything spent on Tessa's upbringing now belonged to the family. The words were not emotional. They sounded planned, rehearsed, like they had already decided this long before the call. When Tessa tried to push back, asking how love and care could be turned into debt, the response changed. Corbin grew colder and said the issue was not open for discussion. Marissa added that the family was under pressure and sacrifices had to be made by everyone. Then the truth slipped out in fragments. The money was not just about repayment. It was needed immediately. The family was facing a serious financial crisis that could not be ignored. Bills were piling up, investments had failed, and pressure from creditors was increasing. The situation was urgent and unstable. Tessa stayed silent as more details came out. The demand was not just about the past, it was about survival in the present. Then Blaine's name entered the conversation. At first, it was mentioned casually, then with frustration. It became clear that Blaine had been involved in several risky business attempts. What started as ambition had turned into failure after failure. Debts had grown larger than anyone expected, and now they were spreading across the entire family. The parents did not admit responsibility. Instead, they framed it as unavoidable damage that had to be fixed quickly. And once again, the focus shifted back to Tessa. She understood the pattern immediately. Every time something went wrong in the family, she was the one expected to absorb the cost. Emotional distance made it easier for them to ask. But this time felt different. The number was huge. The pressure was intense. And there was something else that kept repeating in her mind. Grandpa had known. The envelope, the warning, the exact timing, it all pointed to preparation. Somehow, he had anticipated that this exact demand would come after his death. That thought did not bring comfort. It created tension. Because if Grandpa had seen this coming, then there had to be a reason he prepared something in advance. And whatever that was, it had not been opened yet. Another phone call came late at night. Corbin's voice was sharp, and Marissa's tone carried pressure that felt heavier than before. The same demand was repeated again, but now with warnings that refusal would lead to legal action and public humiliation within the family circle. The call ended without room for discussion. That night, the envelope that had been untouched for days was finally opened. Inside was nothing like expected. There was no explanation, no long message, no emotional farewell. Only a small flash drive wrapped in paper and a single folded note written in Grandpa Alden's handwriting. The note said only one thing: follow these steps exactly. Trust me. No signature, no details, no comfort beyond those words. Along with the note were short instructions written in clear order. The first instruction was to stay silent, not to tell Corbin or Marissa anything, not even to hint that anything had been opened. The second instruction was even stricter. The contents of the flash drive were not to be viewed yet under any condition. Instead, a list of places was included. Specific locations. A storage unit. A bank office. A small locked cabinet in a legal office downtown. Each place had a time and a code attached. At first, it felt confusing. None of it made sense. But there was something about the way it was written that made it impossible to ignore. Every line was precise, as if it had been planned long in advance. Following the instructions began the next morning. The first stop was a storage unit under Grandpa's name. Inside were sealed folders labeled with dates and names. Some were old, some recent, but all carefully organized. The next stop was a bank where a safety deposit box was opened using a code provided in the note. Inside were more documents, including financial records that looked connected to the family. Each step revealed another piece, but never the full picture. What stood out most was how prepared everything felt. Nothing was random. Even small details like timestamps and file orders suggested careful planning over many years. As the list continued, Tessa started noticing a pattern. Every document, every location, and every instruction seemed to connect back to the same idea. It was not just storage. It was structure. A system built to activate only when certain conditions were met. By the end of the day, it was clear this was not something created after the funeral. It had been arranged long before it. Every step pointed to one simple truth. Grandpa had been waiting for something to happen. The documents collected from different locations were brought together and placed on a table in a quiet room. One by one, they were opened. At first, they seemed like normal financial papers, but the more they were reviewed, the more unsettling the pattern became. Bank statements showed repeated transfers that did not match what Tessa remembered about her own accounts. Money that was supposed to be set aside for her education appeared to have been moved at different times, often without clear explanation. Some transactions were labeled in vague ways that made them hard to trace. Property records added another layer. Assets that were meant to benefit her future were tied to accounts controlled by Corbin and Marissa. Instead of being protected or saved, they were being used elsewhere. The names on the paperwork showed how deeply control had been centralized within the parents' hands. Private journals left by Grandpa Alden gave context to the numbers. His handwriting described conversations he had overheard, small contradictions he had noticed, and moments where financial decisions did not match the family's explanations. He wrote carefully, never accusing directly, but always observing. Old family agreements were also included. Some were signed during earlier years, when trust had not yet fully broken. They showed promises made about education funds, inheritance structures, and financial responsibilities. Each agreement highlighted a system that was supposed to protect fairness but had slowly been bypassed. As everything was placed side by side, the truth became harder to ignore. The money connected to Tessa's name had not stayed in place. Over time, it had been redirected toward Blaine. College expenses, personal investments, and even gifts from relatives were quietly shifted and absorbed into his support. The scale of it was larger than expected. It was not a single mistake or one-time decision. It looked like a long pattern repeated over years, always justified in some way, always hidden behind family explanations. Grandpa's notes made it clear that he had noticed this long before anyone else. He had tracked it carefully, collecting proof step by step without interference. But buried deeper in the documents was something more serious. There were hints that Corbin and Marissa had been expecting a significant inheritance after Grandpa's passing. Their financial planning seemed to depend on it. When that expectation failed, frustration turned into urgency. The demand for money that followed was not random. It was connected to the gap left behind by what they believed they were about to receive. Everything now pointed to a family structure built on shifting money, hidden decisions, and expectations that were never meant to be questioned. Tessa arranged a meeting with Sullivan Mercer in a small office downtown. The room was quiet, filled with old files and the faint smell of paper and wood polish. Mercer did not waste time with greetings. He looked tired, like someone carrying a story he had been holding for too long. He opened a locked folder and placed it on the desk. Inside were copies of documents Tessa had already seen, but also notes that had never been shared before. Mercer finally spoke in a low voice, explaining that none of this was random. Grandpa Alden had been watching the family for years, not in a controlling way, but in a careful, patient way. He noticed patterns in behavior, especially around money and responsibility. He saw how decisions always seemed to shift pressure toward Tessa whenever problems appeared. Mercer explained that Alden never believed this would stop on its own. Before his death, he prepared a full plan, not just for inheritance, but for protection. The envelope, the instructions, and every location Tessa had been sent to were part of a system designed with a single purpose. It was not about revenge. It was about exposure. Each step was meant to reveal intent, not just actions. If Corbin and Marissa behaved normally, nothing would have changed. But if they showed pressure, demand, or manipulation, it would activate a deeper set of safeguards. Mercer then said something that changed the tone of the entire conversation. Alden never finished the final step himself. He left it incomplete on purpose. According to him, no written plan could fully prove the truth unless the family exposed themselves first. The system only worked if they made certain choices on their own. Tessa sat quietly as Mercer explained further. The idea was simple but sharp. The evidence alone was not enough. Behavior mattered more. Every demand, every threat, every attempt to pressure Tessa added weight to the case Alden had built. Mercer leaned back and said that everything was now unfolding exactly as Alden predicted. The demand for money, the pressure, and the urgency were not surprises. They were triggers. Each action from Corbin and Marissa was completing the structure step by step. Without realizing it, they were filling in the final pieces of something already designed long ago. The room felt heavier after that. It was clear now that nothing happening was accidental. Every move had already been anticipated, and the only thing left was the final outcome that their own actions were creating. The family gathering was held in Corbin's house. The living room was filled with relatives sitting closely together, some whispering before the conversation even began. The air felt tense, like everyone was waiting for a conflict they already expected. Corbin stood first. His voice was steady, but carefully shaped to sound tired and burdened. He spoke about responsibility, about how families should support each other when things get difficult. He described the financial pressure they were facing, making it sound like a shared struggle that required unity. Marissa followed immediately. Her tone was sharper. She said Tessa had been distant, ungrateful, and unwilling to understand the family's situation. She painted the request for money as something reasonable, even necessary, given everything the family had done in the past. Around the room, relatives reacted in different ways. Some nodded slowly, influenced by the way the story was being told. Others stayed silent but observant, unsure of the full truth. The atmosphere shifted toward quiet judgment. Then Blaine spoke. He looked uncomfortable but tried to appear innocent. He said he never wanted conflict and only hoped the family could stay together. His words were careful, avoiding responsibility while still benefiting from the sympathy in the room. All eyes eventually turned to Tessa. She did not respond immediately. There was no rush in her movement, no urgency in her expression. For a long time, she had always defended herself in moments like this. Explained. Justified. Tried to be understood. This time was different. She stayed quiet. The silence created confusion. Corbin expected resistance. Marissa expected emotion. Even Blaine looked uncertain. But nothing came. Inside her mind, the instructions from Grandpa Alden were clear. Every step until now had led here. The final condition was not in a document or a letter. It was in behavior, timing, and choice. The family believed they were controlling the situation, but the structure around them had already been shaped long before they gathered in this room. Corbin continued speaking, trying to fill the silence. Marissa added pressure again, hoping to force a reaction. Relatives shifted in their seats, waiting for something to break. Still, Tessa said nothing. Instead, she slowly reached for the flash drive that had been kept hidden since the beginning. No announcement was made. No warning was given. The action was calm, deliberate, and certain. At that moment, the tone of the room changed. It was no longer a discussion. It was the point where everything prepared long before this gathering was about to reach its final step. The flash drive was connected to a small screen brought into the room. At first, there was only static. The relatives leaned forward slightly, unsure of what would appear. Corbin and Marissa stood stiffly, watching with forced confidence that slowly began to fade. Then the image cleared. Grandpa Alden appeared on the screen. He looked older than in memory, but his expression was calm and focused, as if he had chosen every word carefully before recording. The room went completely silent. He began speaking directly to the family. His voice was steady, without anger, but firm enough to hold attention. He did not waste time on introductions. He went straight to the reason the video existed. Documents appeared beside him on the screen as he spoke. Bank records, account summaries, and dated entries were shown one after another. Each one matched the names and transactions that had already been questioned before. He explained how funds meant for Tessa had been moved over time. Not once, but repeatedly. Each transfer was small enough to avoid attention, but together they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The room shifted uncomfortably as more details appeared. Some relatives looked at Corbin and Marissa with confusion, others with disbelief. The confidence they had shown earlier started to crack. Grandpa continued, explaining how this pattern was not accidental. It was consistent, planned, and hidden through careful wording and timing. He described how opportunities given to Tessa had slowly been redirected elsewhere, always justified in ways that sounded acceptable on the surface. Then the tone of the video changed slightly. His expression became heavier. He revealed that before his death, Corbin and Marissa had made quiet attempts to influence his estate decisions. They had asked questions about control, suggested changes, and tried to shift arrangements in their favor without directly stating their intent. The room reacted immediately. Murmurs spread. Some relatives turned their attention fully toward Corbin and Marissa, who now looked less certain, their earlier confidence replaced with visible discomfort. The evidence on screen supported every claim, showing records of conversations and requests that had never been made public. Grandpa's voice remained steady throughout, but the meaning behind it was becoming harder to ignore. This was not only about money that had been moved, it was about intention that had been hidden for years. As the video continued, it was clear that what had started as a family dispute was now turning into something far more serious, and the explanation was not yet finished. The video shifted after a short pause. The screen changed, and Grandpa Alden's expression became even more serious. The tone of his voice also changed, slower and more precise, as if every word had been prepared long before that moment. He explained that what had been shown so far was only part of the plan. The real purpose was not just to expose past actions, but to test what would happen after his death. He had been waiting to see how the family would behave once he was no longer present to stop them. Then he mentioned the $500,000 demand directly. It was not a surprise to him. He said it was expected, almost calculated. That demand was the final condition he had been watching for. If Tessa was ever targeted financially in that exact way, a set of legal protections would automatically activate. These were not normal instructions. They were built into trust agreements and financial structures that had been arranged quietly over time. The moment the demand letter was created and sent, it triggered a chain of actions already written into those agreements. On the screen, documents began to appear again. This time, they showed transfers of ownership, updated trust records, and account changes that were legally binding. Everything was dated and verified. Grandpa explained that several assets had been held in protected trusts for years. These were not visible to the family in normal circumstances. However, once the condition was met, full control of those assets would move to Tessa without delay. At the same time, other benefits that Corbin and Marissa had expected to receive were removed. Access rights were revoked automatically through the same structure. Nothing required negotiation or approval at that stage. The room reacted immediately. Confusion turned into shock as people tried to understand what was happening. Corbin stepped forward slightly, but stopped when he realized the changes were already complete on paper. Marissa's expression shifted as she looked at the documents being displayed. Blaine stayed silent, no longer acting confident. The earlier pressure in the room disappeared completely. Grandpa's voice remained steady throughout the explanation. He said none of this was based on emotion. It was based on behavior and choices made after his death. He had expected exactly this response. The demand, the pressure, and the attempt to control Tessa financially were not surprises. They were confirmations. Everything that had been built over years was now complete. The structure had reacted exactly as designed, and there was no step left undone. Months passed, and the family was no longer the same. The house that once felt loud with arguments and control now stayed quiet. Conversations became short, and gatherings became rare. The tension that had once filled every room had turned into distance. Corbin and Marissa struggled to adjust to what followed. Their position in the family circle weakened as more relatives learned what had happened. People who once agreed with them slowly stepped back. Invitations stopped coming. Support faded. What remained was the reality of their decisions and how they had affected everyone around them. Blaine, who had always stayed in the background of family decisions, was finally forced to face his own choices. Without constant protection or excuses from others, he had to deal with the results of his actions. For the first time, responsibility could not be avoided or shifted onto someone else. Tessa did not raise her voice through any of it. There were no public arguments, no attempts to humiliate anyone, and no effort to create revenge. Even when questioned by relatives or approached with opinions, she remained steady and quiet. She did not fight for attention or approval anymore. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life step by step. The changes that came after the final video were not used as weapons. They were simply accepted as reality. Work, plans, and decisions slowly began to move forward in a new direction. The resources left behind by Grandpa Alden were used carefully. Nothing was wasted or rushed. Every decision was made with patience, as if following a path he had already imagined long before. Over time, life began to feel different. Not perfect, but stable in a way that had never existed before. The pressure that once defined every family interaction no longer had control. One day, Tessa returned to the cemetery where Grandpa was buried. The visit was quiet. There were no words at first, only standing still and remembering everything that had led to this point. In that silence, something became clear. The greatest gift was not the financial change or the documents or even the system he had built. It was the protection it created. It ensured that no one could define her worth through control, pressure, or demands again. It broke a cycle that had lasted for years and replaced it with something steady. Walking away from the grave, there was no anger left, only understanding that his final act was not about punishment, but about making sure she would finally be free to live without being treated as something owed.